Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, good. Well, thank you, JJ, for the introduction. As you heard, I am a public school teacher, and I put it out on Facebook whether I should be drinking during this presentation about prohibition. And I decided after former students got on Facebook and said, Mr. Boggs, you should definitely drink. I was like, I'm not going to do that. So I have my water right here. Maybe I'll drink afterwards. So anyhow, I want to begin with this image, this sketching that I saw in one of the first articles when I started researching this topic. This is a sketching from a 1927 article from the New York Times. And the journalist had went undercover with a gang of rum runners in the Ecorse Wyandotte area. And he was interviewing them. Some of these rum runners were talking about how they had made millions transporting booze from Windsor across the Detroit River into the downriver area. It reminded me of actually, I had interviewed several relatives of a guy by the name of Buck Raymond. He made thousands, if not millions of dollars during the rum running years from 1918 to I think the late 20s before he was shot and his arm was crippled. But anyhow, it reminded me of that story. But what really got me thinking about this specific sketching is that lurking in the shadows is this guy in the vehicle, behind the wheel in the truck. And I got to thinking, you know what? We really haven't thought about what role did the automobile play in Prohibition, and specifically, what role did it play in our local region, which was known as the automotive center of the world. So I started looking into that for this research topic. And, you know, there has been some great Prohibition books already written locally. One that I can point to for sure is this book by Philip Mason. I think he was a professor at Wayne State University. He wrote this book called Rum Running in the Roaring 20s, and it focused primarily on the Metro Detroit experience, the dry experience. And like a lot of Prohibition histories, it focused on the waterborne traffic. Then you also have Nothing Personal, Just Business by local historian Kenneth Dixon. He wrote a book about the gangster underworld of the Glass City. It's a great book if you want to look into the rivalry between Jackie Kennedy and Yanni Iacovoli, and I use that quite a bit for my research. But once again, it's a very local perspective of Toledo's Prohibition history. And then, of course, you have the Rum Runners Prohibition scrapbook by Marty Gervais. He's a Canadian historian. He did a lot of his work by actually interviewing decades ago some of these rum runners who were still living and some of the enforcement officials who were responsible for what was going on the Windsor side of things. So once again, a very local perspective of Prohibition. All these books I would definitely recommend if you're trying to add to your library, get these ones. So my book, you know, Prohibition's Proving Ground, is a little bit different. Actually, I would say a lot different, because it does focus on the motor car culture and how it impacted rum running and Prohibition enforcement locally. And if you think about it, the automobile really does change the game for rum runners. They can decide when, where, and basically how they smuggle their alcohol by kind of manipulating their vehicles. And then you have these law enforcers who are always playing this catch-up game and maybe not always being supplied with the types of resources they need to enforce the Prohibition laws in the age of the automobile. Another thing that's different about this book, unlike these very local histories of Prohibition, I'm kind of going from a regional perspective. And the reason why I'm doing that is because the criminals who were kind of exposing the Prohibition laws didn't think from a local standpoint. They didn't think about, oh, I'm only going to, you know, smuggle within these city limits or up into this border. They exploited borders, especially during this time period where you had competing Prohibition legislation. And once again, the officers are forced to think regionally. So there's this area that I call the Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor that is created by the Prohibition and smuggling era. And then finally, research was primarily with newspapers. I sometimes would spend, you know, 6 hours at a time going for microfilm at the Ellis Library here in Monroe, or sometimes at the museum. I'd be those big volumes of newspapers and just studying them for hours upon hours. And what that allowed me to do is really get a sense of what the day-to-day dry experience was like in our region. So that's how my book's a little bit different. So I kind of want to set the scene here before I get into some of the Prohibition era type stuff. Booze culture had existed for a couple centuries before Prohibition hits the scene. And in fact, when Cadillac comes to Detroit to settle in the area, one of the major things that he's trading with Native Americans is alcohol. And obviously he doesn't have a great impact on the local community. But from the very founding of our region, alcohol played an important role. And by the time that Prohibition starts to be thought of seriously in the 1910s, down in Toledo in the Glass City, you have 408 saloons that are closed on the day that Prohibition happens there. When you go up to Detroit, they have 1,500 saloons. I think it was 17 breweries and distilleries in the Motor City. Across the river, you had some of the greatest booze being produced in Walkerville. The Canadian Club whiskey was being produced in the Walkerville brewery distillery there. And you had several breweries in the border cities area. And then in a place like Monroe, a medium-sized town, they had 20 bars, close to 20 bars, and even 2 breweries. I think maybe we have like 5 or 6 now. We have 0 breweries. I'd love to see breweries come back in the city of Monroe. But it just goes to show how booze was kind of essential almost in these COVID times, to say it was almost essential business on the Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor. And it's not really until the 1910s does the automobile industry, which is what we're known for now, take off. You have John Willys in 1909 establish his company, the Willys Overland, and in 10 years, that is the second best-selling car brand in the country. Then obviously, if you go across to Windsor, Windsor becomes the automotive capital of that country. In the 1920s and 30s, it's producing the most cars out of any Canadian city. And then across the river, you have Henry Ford revolutionizing the automobile industry. 13 of the 15 top-selling car brands are in the Metro Detroit area. And Henry Ford has a lot to do with it. His mass manufacturing techniques, his ability to lower prices for cars makes the car affordable for the common Joe, the average Joe. And, that really gets a lot of people in those vehicles. And it changes the economy. You have a guy like W.J. Whiteford down in Monroe who used to just focus on horse implements and harnesses and so forth. He's forced to start selling automobile tires because he has to adjust to the advancing economy. So this is really an interesting time in the Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor because the automobile industry is definitely booming. And it has both negative and positive effects. One of the major positive effects, obviously, is employment. In Toledo, I want to say it was in the mid-1910s, the Willys Overland Company was the #1 employer. 15,000 workers were working in that factory. Ford Motor Company, just Ford Motor Company, had 108,000, I think, in the year 1920. And then I want to say 40% of people living, 40% of workers in the Windsor area were working in some kind of capacity in the automobile industry. So it really has this huge impact and changes the entire culture of the region. But one thing to really consider here too is that there had been prohibitionists for decades prior to the automobile boom, and they weren't very successful. The WCTU, yes, they had this local kind of acclaim. They start to grow. And then you have the National Prohibition Party, but doesn't really win any elections. And then you have, the Anti-Saloon League, who become pretty famous, but they never really get any serious legislation passed. But in the 1910s, when the automobile industry takes off and the culture takes off, they start developing these arguments that are quite effective. And that's why you see prohibition, in my opinion, prohibition legislation start to be passed during this time period, because they're seeing how automobiles are killing pedestrians on the street, even without drunk drivers. So if there are drunk people behind the wheels, they're going to see more and more people being killed, not only behind the wheel, but also on the streets. And that's something they do not want. Also, there's that effective argument that these workers, these factory workers or any kind of workers, were spending their wages at the saloon that could have been used to, get into the middle class and afford that new car that everyone else is driving around. So they're using that argument to their advantage too. But probably most important for the Prohibition movement is the fact that the automobile tycoons, the automobile magnates like Henry Ford, John Willys, Gordon McGregor over in Windsor are supporting the Prohibition movement. And this is for obvious reasons. They desperately want these saloons that are at the factory gates to be removed from there. And in fact, John Willys, in one of his newspaper interviews, says that he wants to build the world's largest restaurant inside his factory, so his factory workers don't leave to go to these saloons and come back drunk. And because, once again, if you have drunk workers, you have inefficient workers, and sometimes those inefficient workers often engage in injurious actions also on the job. So it's a problem for a lot of these automobile manufacturers. So they throw their support behind the Prohibition movement. What most Americans don't realize is that Prohibition actually does start in 1920 with the 18th Amendment. It actually starts in a patchwork fashion. Various states throughout the country pass their own state prohibition laws. On the Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor, however, it begins actually in Windsor. They pass the Ontario Temperance Act, the OTA, and this takes force in September, I think, 1916. And the last days are pretty wild. If you read the newspaper accounts, you have elderly women on their knees begging for booze to give to their drunk husbands before the Prohibition law takes effect. You have farmers coming from the outskirts to load up their trucks full of beer. And you have these crowds descending upon these liquor stores and these hotels, and they exhaust the booze supply that very last night at 7 p.m. So guess what they do? They get on the ferries to go over to Detroit to continue their drunken ways. And that results in some problems over there. There's several arrests. So it's a rowdy night, to say the least. But what's interesting about the OTA is there was definitely some loopholes. As you can see in this full page ad that you have here on your screen, you could still get your alcohol delivered to your doorstep by car. The OTA actually bans the sale of alcohol, but not the importation of alcohol or the production of alcohol. So what you could do is you can make a phone call to an office in Detroit who would import the alcohol from your local brewery in Windsor to your doorstep. That would count as not violating the OTA. And that went on for a few years there. It was kind of a humorous way, a humorous loophole in that law. And then, Michigan goes dry a couple of years later in 1918 by a 75,000 person vote. It's a pretty significant vote. But as you can see, there's a interesting corridor that's forming in Michigan. Those black counties, those are the black counties that voted against the state prohibition measure. So sure enough, Monroe County and Wayne counties were against this new state prohibition law. And but to no avail, they couldn't stop it. It was coming May 1st, 1918. The previous night, April 30th, 1918, everyone's expecting a rowdy night in Detroit and even in Monroe. But what they find is actually kind of strange. It's eerily dead. Where are all these rowdy drinkers at? Well, apparently they had started going down to Toledo prior to the passage of the state prohibition law and getting drunk down there. I've had the privilege to actually go up in the attic of the Toledo Police Department in downtown, and that's what it looks like, these stacks of books. These are the old arrest logs. And I would estimate that 15% of the people arrested during this time period in Toledo were Michiganders for drunken disorderly charges. It's unbelievable the number of, you'd probably find a bunch of relatives from the Monroe or Detroit areas. So it's really interesting to believe. And then eventually these same drinkers are thinking about, you know what, I can make a little bit of money by smuggling some of these small amounts of booze up with me. So they start putting their coat pockets and so forth on the interurban. So there, I don't know if you guys know what the interurban is. The interurban was an electric trolley system that operated between the Toledo and Detroit areas. And this trolley system, these drinkers would get on that and come back and so forth. Smuggling on this interurban system, but sure enough, these law enforcers start to catch on that there's people smuggling, they catch them. So therefore, these smugglers become more crafty. They develop fake babies to carry booze in, violin cases with a partition. You have a loaf of bread where you unscrew the top and it's a flask. And then you also have this device at the bottom. What would happen is these females would board the interurban in a place like Monroe, skinny as a rail, and come back 9 months pregnant. And sure enough, it was a kind of a large flask that was strapped around your stomach. And they had to hire a matron officer soon enough to discover some of these interesting contraptions. All right. But then another development that really changes the game for rum running is the opening of the paved Dixie Highway. The Dixie Highway prior to this had always been a major thoroughfare through Monroe County. It was really the major highway that connected Toledo to Detroit. But the major problem up to this point in October 1918 was that it was a muddy mess throughout major stretches of the highway, especially between Newport and Monroe, and then from Monroe basically all the way to the border. You can see here a picture of LaSalle. If you know where Trappers is at, this is a picture looking north up the Dixie Highway. Trappers would be on the right-hand side there. That's what the road looked like. And the picture up the top is near Newport. So they paved this road over. However, this is definitely a benefit to the rum runners who are starting to use their cars. And eventually this highway becomes known as the Avenue des Booze for the number of rum runners who are exploiting this newly paved highway connecting Toledo to Detroit. And, because, Toledo is still wet and Detroit is dry. And right around the same time, there's this huge national headlines bust by the state troopers in Michigan of the Billingsley Gang. And the picture of the cars here of the Billingsley Gang is shown. So the Billingsley Gang, they had been exploiting, their group of like brothers and friends. They had been exploiting state prohibition laws throughout the country. They were first in Washington, then in Kansas, but then they realized, you know what? This Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor is going to be a pretty profitable area to do some smuggling. So they end up doing that for several months. They buy up a bunch of cars. They purchase some warehouses in Toledo. They establish connections with grocery men in Detroit. So they start smuggling load after load in their vehicles up to Detroit. But they didn't realize that an agent had infiltrated their group. And I think it might be September 30th or October 1st, they're busted near Lambertville with these 5 vehicles and tons of booze. And after the trial is all said and done, they basically come to the conclusion that this Billingsley gang had made in a matter of 2 months $160,000 back then, which is, an exorbitant amount of money today. And right around the same time, I think the Detroit law enforcers who had been pretty lax at the very beginning of state prohibition realized they need to start enforcing the law themselves. So sure enough, they start cracking down on motorists and they start finding thousands of gallons of booze and tin cans and gasoline cans. They also caught one interesting individual who was smuggling bottles of alcohol through extra spicy green peppers. So apparently this individual was selling bushels of green peppers. And if you asked for the extra spicy ones, you would also get a bottle of booze in those. So they caught this guy as well. But the real action was occurring near the Michigan state line. The opening of the Dixie Highway, as I mentioned, transformed the rum running business. You had rum runners who would maybe redesign their cars under the floorboards of the back of their truck. You'd see wrapped up bottles. You would have seats redesigned to hide booze. So eventually, they start stopping every vehicle during the day. but they're not catching these very aggressive rum runners who are plowing through their stops. So they ultimately end up deploying what's called Little Bertha. This was an armored vehicle left over from the World War I. So they deploy it on the Dixie Highway south of Erie, and they think that they're going to start ramming some of these rum runners with this vehicle. However, they didn't realize they couldn't really see out the vehicle, and they actually got into an accident with a non-rum running vehicle, so they had to take it off the road. There's another incident that's pretty infamous that occurs just north of the Dunbar Road, just south of Monroe here. So what happens is they get word that there's a rum running convoy coming up the Dixie Highway at a fast speed. So they have two squads. When the cars fly through the first squad, they signal up the road, and sure enough, the second squad drops a log, a telephone pole, or something of that sort on the road. One of the cars hits it at like 70 miles per hour, turns turtle, as the newspapers call it. Booze spills out into the highway. It becomes a huge newspaper story, not just locally, but in the entire state. The governor tells them to stop doing this kind of stuff. They get in trouble. They actually get sued for $2,000 by the rum runners, and the rum runners are successful with that suit. So it's a really interesting time to be a law enforcer during the early days of Prohibition in Michigan. And then it becomes even more interesting because the law enforcers came and enforced the law on February 18th, 1919. The so-called booze rush begins. What happens at the Michigan State Supreme Court level is they invalidate the ability for the law enforcers to search and seize alcohol from people. And that includes vehicles. So guess what everyone and their mother does? They go down to Toledo in their cars on the interurban, start loading up booze and taking it back up to Detroit to sell. And you can see the Dixie Highway here at the bottom, bumper to bumper traffic for 3 days in a row. You had the interurban stations full. And this was national headlines. Everyone was making fun of the entire situation. You have this Newsbee cartoon up in the right-hand side, kind of lampooning what was going on, all the accidents, all the kind of really humorous scenes. And then you have this Detroit Free Press reporter coming down, to check out the wreckage after the booze rush had finished. They had cobbled up enough federal laws to start enforcing it. So this Free Press reporter comes down, and he's capturing photos of all these wrecked cars, and he notices one of the cars. It's actually his car, and it was stolen during the booze rush. He had been wondering what had happened, and sure enough, one of the rum runners had gotten into an accident in his vehicle, took all the booze out, and just ditched it in the Dixie Highway south of Erie. And then, a few more months happen of, Prohibition enforcement. They still are dealing with some pretty severe rum running incidents. But then May 27th, 1919 happens, and that's when Toledo in the state of Ohio passes the Prohibition law. And sure enough, it's a wild night on May 27th. Michiganders in all of Glass City descend upon the bars, purchase all the booze stocks. It's a crazy night. The arrest logs are interesting. Of the number of disorderly and drunk people, but not everyone. I think everyone was in a very happy mood, but not for the same reason. You had one of the Methodist churches, they had been inviting some prohibitionist speakers in. There was this one woman by the name of, I think her name was Mary Armour. They called her the Georgia Cyclone. She was very passionate about her prohibition beliefs. She believed that each saloon keeper was going directly to hell for what they had done. But she also made a prediction, a wrong prediction, that it would take 79,000 years to repeal Prohibition. Obviously, she was a little bit off. But the Ohio state prohibition law is pretty short-lived because 6 months later, national prohibition begins with the 18th Amendment in the United States. And one of the first things that local people start doing in our area when the Volstead Act is coming down the pipeline is they snatch up property along the Detroit River because they know that this is going to be the staging ground for some pretty interesting times and a very profitable investment. And sure enough, in those, I think it was the first 7 months, historians say 900,000 cases of booze crossed the Detroit River from Windsor to Detroit. Because remember, the OTA is allowing Canada, Windsor, to continue to produce booze for export, and they don't care whether you have prohibition nationally in your own country. They're just trying to make money. So you have these boats crisscrossing like crazy in those first few months. And once again, a lot of the historians have focused on the waterborne traffic. What I'm arguing in my book, equally or perhaps even more important, is the automotive traffic that's being involved in the rum running business. Cars are buzzing up and down both sides of the Detroit River to move this product. Because as we know, if you're moving product from shore to shore, you can't just drop it off at shore and expect your customers to get it. You need to deliver it to their doorstep. And that's what these cars are doing. All right. And then, Windsor kind of becomes a notorious spot for criminals and gangsters. It becomes known as the plague spot of Canada. And obviously the people of Windsor in the border city area, the communities around Windsor are called the border city area. They're pretty upset with that designation. So they start to really think about cracking down on these criminals. One humorous event occurs St. Patrick's Day in 1920. So there's an officer in Windsor who sees these guys loading their truck full of crates of beer. I think it was 104 crates from a second-story window. The cop catches them, like, you guys are busted. But he tells them to continue to load it in the truck because he's going to confiscate the truck. At this time, the officers of Windsor did not have a lot of vehicles. In fact, I think they only had 2 motorcycles in 1920 for their entire police department. No cars whatsoever. So he's going to confiscate the car and arrest these guys in the same way. But apparently the officer got drunk on the beer himself and let the guys go. They transported the alcohol to the river shore, and they were able to smuggle it into America. So they're having some serious problems enforcing law without the proper resources, mainly police patrol cars. So they start hiring these kind of, what's a good way to put it, vigilante officers that they know are definitely for prohibition in Windsor. And one of them was by the name of Reverend J.O.L. Spracklin. He was a Methodist minister, and he engaged in some really questionable policing activities. He would accept bribes. He would pull over vehicles after church, like entire families. He was known to specifically target Catholic churches because he always thought those Catholics were drinkers. And maybe that was true. But eventually he gets kicked off the force after he shoots and kills a saloon, an illegal saloon owner. That really kind of stops the crackdown in Windsor, and Windsor becomes a little bit more open after that. Then across the river, there's another guy that's pretty upset with prohibition enforcement. It's a pretty prominent guy. His name is Henry Ford. And if you know anything about Henry Ford, he was very anti-alcohol. And he starts writing letters. His office is writing letters to the Federal Prohibition Commissioner to start enforcing the law in his region, because he's having drunk guys show up to work at his River Rouge factory, which is just newly built. And he starts employing the so-called sniffer test. He'd have his supervisor smell every single person's breath who walked into the factory. And if you had just a tinge of alcohol on your breath, you were being fired immediately. So eventually, Henry Ford's a pretty prominent guy. They start listening to him. The feds start sending officer after officer to raid specifically the E-course area, which is pretty bad in terms of the number of rum runners congregating in that region. And also they deploy their best probably undercover agent, Izzy Einstein. He had done undercover work in New York City, I think Pittsburgh, Chicago, some of the major cities that have been experiencing some prohibition problems. And he goes undercover as an auto worker. And after he's done here, he basically says, this is the worst wet spot in the country. And he had been to all these other cities. So Detroit was making a name for itself during Prohibition, to say the least. And then an important Supreme Court case happens in 1925. It's Carroll versus United States. Prior to the Supreme Court case, a lot of rum runners' crimes were thrown out of court because these officers didn't have the proper search warrant to search their vehicles. So in this case is based off of Fred Cronenwett, who is actually an ex-sheriff in Monroe, but he becomes a federal agent in the the early 20s, and he's enforcing the law on the US 12 highway from Detroit to Chicago, and that was another major thoroughfare for rum runners. And one day he notices an Oldsmobile Roadster zoom past his position, and it's a Roadster he remembers. He knows it's rum runners. So he decides to pull it over, regardless of the fact he doesn't know whether there's alcohol in the vehicle. Pulls it over, and sure enough, there's 68 bottles of scotch underneath the seat. The rum runners challenge him, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where they rule. And actually, I think the Supreme Court justice at that time, the Chief Justice, was William Taft, the former president, and he rules that even though these people have freedom on the highways, officers have the right to pull over any car that they basically have probable cause for. So it's basically, if they have a hunch, they can pull over your car and search through your vehicle. That's the ruling, and it had major ramifications, not only for this period, the Prohibition period, because officers obviously can now just pull over cars willy-nilly, but it has long-standing ramifications for the rest of American history in regards to search and seizure dealing with cars. So sure enough, these rum runners need to become more creative if they want to get past some of these search and seizures. So they start recrafting and redesigning their vehicles. The floorboards, once again, start to pop up. You have a bunch of booze under there, redesigning the seat cushions so you could hide booze there. You also found, more commonly, females behind the wheel of rum running vehicles. And obviously, throughout the teens and 20s, females start to really embrace the automobile because it gives them more freedom. But it still was kind of a stereotype that females behind the wheel were typically not criminals. So therefore, they could get away with a lot more. So whenever a female was caught behind the wheel with alcohol in the back, it was front page news. And it became more and more common in the late 20s. Another humorous instance, a local story, Harold Frey was a Newport native, and he had been driving truck for a grocery store in Detroit. He was delivering a lot of goods from the Monroe County area. And his boss would make him load up milk canisters, 15 of them, in the back of his truck. But the middle couple canisters were always full of liquor. And he would get commonly searched. It was common for him to get stopped by officers patrolling the Dixie Highway, especially the state police in Rockwood. And they would just search the outside canisters, which were actually full of milk, but they never suspected the inside canisters to be full of liquor. And then probably the most humorous example, and this may have been happening throughout the Prohibition period, but they finally caught them in 1926. So there was essentially a motorcade of mourners in a hearse that were on the outskirts of Detroit one day, and the officers were thinking, there's not a cemetery even close here, like miles away. What are these guys doing? And sure enough, they try to start pulling them over. They ditch the vehicles. All the mourners flee. The driver of the hearse flees. They open up the casket. There's 2,400 bottles of booze in that casket. And one thing that they're starting to realize throughout the Prohibition period here is that drunk driving argument is not coming to fruition. In fact, throughout the Prohibition period, a lot of drunk drivers were killing pedestrians. One of the most kind of sad incidents occurred in Erie, Michigan, locally here. A girl by the name of Gertrude Cousineau is waiting for an interurban to take her to her job in the morning to Toledo. Roaring up the road, roaring up the highway just south of Erie there, is a bootlegger and a bartender, and both are drunk. They hit her, they kill her, they drive off trying to flee. They're eventually caught, and I think it was a 10-year prison sentence for manslaughter. There was another incident in Wyandotte where a drunk driver came up to a corner, plowed into the corner, hit a building, and in the process ended up killing a 25-year-old Catholic nun and also a black worker working on the building on that corner. And as you can see in this chart here from Toledo, nearly 400 people were caught in that year driving drunk behind the wheel. So driving drunk was a serious issue. And part of that was due to the fact that a number of roadhouses were starting to open up. Roadhouses, if you don't know what roadhouses are, were these kind of illegal bars that operated outside of the jurisdictions of cities. So therefore, what you would have are these people that are looking to get a drink, drive out to these peripheral areas to drink, and then driving back. So a place like, if you know Angela's Northwood Villa, the villa back then was a roadhouse, a very prominent roadhouse. And I'm sure there was plenty of people driving drunk back and forth from there. And that caused problems on the streets. And then in 1927, something important happens on the Toledo-Detroit-Windsor corridor. The OTA is repealed, and they allow for the sale of alcohol in these government buildings. So sure enough, a lot of Michiganders start going over to just drink there. They're just going to drink as much as they want in these Windsor facilities. And the Ambassador Bridge is opening up around the same time. So traffic is, going over there in record paces. One day, 20,000 cars were counted crossing the Ambassador Bridge to get this alcohol in these new government facilities selling booze. So this is important from the standpoint of the rum runners themselves, because if your customers are no longer needing you to supply them with booze, if they can drive over themselves, there are less customers to supply. And therefore, they're starting to fight over those customers and fight over territory, and it results in a very bloody battle in the late 1920s and early 1930s. If you are aware of Monroe County's history in regards to Prohibition, a lot of our connection is due to the fact that it was kind of a dumping ground for bodies. In 1927 alone, there was 4 bodies found in the city of Monroe or its vicinities. In the late 1920s, it was very, very common for bodies to wash up almost every month on Estrel Beach or Breast Bay. And Toledo gangsters definitely used the proximity to the border to their advantage. They would dump the bullet-ridden bodies of individuals that they had killed who were maybe hijacking their vehicles. There was this one instance that I can recall from a newspaper article. There was a car dealership in Point Place, Ohio, which is a community just north of Toledo. And he had been working with these rum runners, but apparently he had double-crossed them. So they abduct him in front of his children. They take him into a car. They shoot him. They dump him across the state line. And they come back to the house, and they sleep in the house. And they order the kid the next morning to go across the street to get a newspaper. And they force him to read the story about their dad being found dead across. It's a really creepy story. So there's stories like that exist throughout this time period. And then there's these hijacking cases. There's numerous rum runners that are hijacking each other's cars, and it's leading to these battles. And this led directly into a lot of the purple gang killings that occur in Detroit. Probably the most brutal gang that existed throughout the Prohibition era. But what most people don't realize is that the purple gang really wasn't a cohesive gang. It was a loose confederate of rum runners who really didn't have super tight alliances with each other. They just kind of cooperated with each other as they needed. But once they started competing for customers and territory, they started stepping on each other's toes, hijacking each other's vehicles. And it results in the Collingwood Manor Massacre, probably one of the most brutal murders ever perpetrated in Detroit history. What happens is some very important purple gang members have some of their booze supplies hijacked by the Little Jewish Navy, who is kind of a small group of the purple gang. They invite them into a meeting at the Collingwood Manor apartments. And so the Little Jewish Navy is already there. And the 3 purple gang members come up to this apartment building. One of the members stays in the vehicle in the alleyway, and he honks the horn. And that horn is a signal to gun down with Tommy guns all these Little Jewish Navy members in this apartment building. And that's the scene you see, the bloody bodies on the floor there. Eventually, those guys were caught. They would spend the rest of their lives in the Marquette State Prison. Across the river, the hijackings and murders and killings were not very common in Windsor. From what I can gather, based on the newspaper accounts, a lot of these booze trucks that were supplying the legal booze in Windsor were being trailed by officers of the law. So therefore they were protected, and therefore it was less likely for them to suffer from those types of problems. So right around this time, being a prohibitionist, it was already difficult before, it becomes much more difficult. The public is starting to really turn against the law enforcers. It's not uncommon for when an officer tries to raid a building that mobs would descend upon them with clubs and guns and so forth. Officers are killed in the line of duty, trying to enforce the prohibition law. For instance, near Detroit, there was one officer, his name was Vivian Welch, I think it was in 1928. He stops a vehicle for a rum running incident, and he ends up being abducted, shot, and then dumped in an intersection. There's the infamous case of, unfortunately, Edward Kinsey here in Monroe. He conducts a raid on a blind pig near St. Michael's here in Monroe, and he is greeted by gunfire, is killed, as well as the blind pig operator is also killed too. So eventually, this kind of creates, for these dry agents who are enforcing the law, kind of a jadedness almost. There was this one officer by the name of Howard Barker who was known as one of the best dry agents, and he's trailing this one vehicle and then gets into an accident and becomes crippled, and they don't really help they don't really help him deal with his problems, his medical bills. So therefore, he continues as a corrupt agent and ends up being indicted in a federal corruption ring with 10 other officers in the Detroit area. The number of corruption cases skyrockets in the late 1920s, and I think it's because they're just being overwhelmed by the number of problems they're dealing with. And they figure, if these guys are making money, I might as well make money too. But there are still some officers in the late 20s who take their job very seriously. But unfortunately, they start gravitating to using their guns because of, the brutal crimes that are happening. And so in 1929, at the mouth of the Swan Creek, state troopers shoot a rum runner who's leading a convoy of cars across the ice. It was headline news throughout the state. There was a Wyandotte bootlegger that was shot and killed, smuggling barrels of booze on the outskirts of Detroit. But there was other incidents where officers used their guns in incidents where they thought they were stopping bootleggers, but they really weren't. The primary case that made national headlines was William Nederme. He was a postal carrier from Rockwood, and he was duck hunting near Point Mouillet, I guess if you're French. He was duck hunting one night, and the officers didn't realize that. They thought he was rum running because that was a common rum running spot. They shot him, and it becomes, like I said, national news. And you start seeing cartoons develop. And cars with bumper stickers and flags on the back saying "Don't shoot! I'm not a bootlegger." It's that serious in terms of the shootings that are happening by officers. And then, if you're really interested in the Toledo history of things in regards to prohibition, there's a massive killing spree that happens in the 1930s. From 1931 to 1933, 14 gangsters who are involved in rum running are shot and killed in the Glass City area. And it's mainly because of this rivalry between Jackie Kennedy and Yanni Iacovoli. Yanni Iacovoli was just simply brutal. And Jackie Kennedy was kind of like the sweetheart of Toledo, the bootlegger everyone loved. And at one point, he decides to lower his price on beers, and Yanni Iacovoli starts really going after him. And so I think it's in November 1932, they find out what car he's driving. It's like a gold sedan in downtown Toledo. So numerous individuals that Yanni Icavoli hires corners him in a part of downtown, and they shoot. They fill his car full of bullets. He actually doesn't. He never gets hit, but his girlfriend does, and she dies. So that was major news, and that really turned the tide in favor of Jackie Kennedy and against really prohibition still existing. But then eventually, as you probably know, Jackie Kennedy, about, I would say 6 months later, is shot and killed in Point Place by gangsters in cars. And once again, cars are instrumental for these rum runners, not only to smuggle the booze, but also to commit these brutal crimes to make sure that people aren't crossing them or competing with them. And at the end of Prohibition, the perspective of a lot of these automotive tycoons change. Alfred Sloan, the CEO of GM, after the Valentine's Day Massacre, which obviously explodes on the national headlines, he starts his own group against Prohibition, even though he was for Prohibition before it, called the Crusaders. You have John Willis actively saying we need to repeal Prohibition because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression is occurring obviously in 1929 to 1933, the end of Prohibition. So he's saying we need to repeal this dry law to help, pay for some of these expenses that were had in society. The taxation that would result from obviously taxing liquor would help in the belief of John Willis, and he was accurate about that. And then you have someone like Harvey Firestone, who's a personal friend of Henry Ford, who's making the tires for all of his cars, change his stance also, which was pretty eye-opening. And then probably the most prominent automobile tycoon who changes his view on Prohibition was Henry B. Joy, I think he's the Oldsmobile guy. And he actually has his personal property raided in Grosse Pointe. His boathouse, the doors kicked open by officers who are being super aggressive. They never find any alcohol. So he turns against Prohibition as well because of those personal experiences, and really is a very vocal proponent of repealing Prohibition. And then even Henry Ford changes tune at the very end when Michigan repeals Prohibition. They're the first state to repeal Prohibition. And a few days later, he holds a banquet and he serves beer against all the beliefs that he had espoused prior to that. So what's ironic about the end of Prohibition, obviously, as I mentioned, Michigan first state to repeal it, the beer and the booze comes back on the back of a car. They back up to these bars, these saloons, and it's a wild, crazy night. I think it's December 5th, 1933 is the first night. So the car brings back the booze in a legal format. But the argument of this book, once again, is that the car made Prohibition unenforceable. It basically allowed these rum runners to do what they wished whenever they wanted. They are always one step ahead of the law enforcers, who often weren't equipped with the same kind of automotive resources that the bootleggers had, the rum runners had. So I would argue that Prohibition was essentially taken for a ride, just like a lot of those guys who were unfortunately killed during the Prohibition period. It was taken for a death ride. And I don't know what you think about that, but I'm kind of thankful that I was taken for a death ride, because after this, I'll be drinking a little bit of bourbon and I'll enjoy it. So that's what I got. That's my presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot, Joe. I'd like to open it up to questions now. We'd prefer that you raise your hand, but if you don't want to, have your voice on camera, you're more than welcome to type it in the chat feature. And while I have you, before you leave, if you haven't typed in to let us know where you're from and you'd like to share that with us, that'd be awesome. Um, Viola?
Hi. I was wondering, a friend of ours who was here and watched part of the presentation, Mike Newcomer, lives in a house out on the beach area.
Yeah, right.
And
Bowles Harbor area.
Bowles Harbor, and he was told his old house was called the Avalon Beach Tea Room. And he heard stories from the neighbors, and I was wondering if Joe ever heard of it.
I haven't heard of that specific location, but I do have several newspaper articles that attest to the fact that rum running was occurring in the Bowles Harbor, Avalon Beach area. Yeah, so it definitely was a very active point for rum running. I'm trying to think of the specific articles off the top of my head, but I can't right now. I wish I had my newspaper articles in front of me.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Richard?
Yes. Hello, Joe. How you doing?
Great. How are you?
Very fine. I'm just going to mention some words, and maybe you can conjure up who this I'm talking about. There was a blind pig on Lorraine and Arbor Streets. It was Maria's Silver Dollar Bar here in Monroe, Plum Creek Bay and Monroe Marshes. The BATF, the Purple Gang, jalopies with roofs cut off and steel plates behind the driver. BATF is Bureau Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, US 24 Telegraph Road, and torpedoes from Chicago. Does all that mean anything to you? I'm surrounded here by stuff I got from the guy. I knew him personal.
Yeah, not all that information kind of connects with me, but there was definitely a blind pig operating in Plum Creek. I do have a newspaper article at the very end of Prohibition that was raided near the Plum Creek area, almost over there by kind of by the quarry, I believe. Is the Plum Creek's by the quarry, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good
Yeah.
spot.
So there was a blind pig, and I forget the name of that specific blind pig. What was the name that you just provided there of the?
There was Maria's Silver Dollar Bar, but that was downtown.
That was downtown. Okay.
Yeah.
But in regards to you had something about the Purple Gang as well.
Oh yeah, on the east end of Monroe. I worked with a butcher in my dad's store who knew all those people. He saw them bring their machine guns with them and all that kind of stuff. It was really interesting to see that and to hear about it.
Yeah, I would argue that Monroe was a spot where purple gangsters would go to kind of lay low between Detroit and Toledo. It was very, very common. We have numerous newspaper articles, even from the New York Times, saying that Monroe is the place where some of these purple gangsters go to hide out. There was these huge raids, these huge busts that they'd find stockpiles of guns. And there was a few shootings in which people were killed in the East End. And from what I can gather, it was almost always people double crossing Purple Gang type members.
Yeah, it was an interesting day, interesting times.
That's for sure. Yeah.
I've got one for you too.
Go ahead, shoot, talk. Jeannie, my wife, Jeannie, wants to talk.
Yeah, great.
A lady that's deceased now, Gladys Kibberts. I knew her very well, and she was in her 80s and 90s. And she was telling us one day at Garden Club, they lived out at Bowles Harbor, and she said she was very young, and she used to wear knee boots, white ones, even in her elder years. And she said they were at home one evening with the family, and she was not married. She was younger at the time, and they heard something going bump in the night. So they went out there and looked, and she says, oh my, it was a rowboat full of booze. So of course they pulled it in and enjoyed it.
Yep, exactly. Yep. It was very common for kind of boats to just kind of be left alone by themselves after maybe they had been found out that they were trying to smuggle this booze in. So farmers would sometimes go to the Swan Creek in Newport, I know this, and discover caches of booze and just bring it back to the farm and enjoy it amongst each other. So that was very common actually to find caches of booze along the creek or along the lake shore.
David?
I had a little bit of live there with Mr. Micka was stating I owned the old Kentucky Park. Now that was a well-known resting area for the Purple Gang. And I know I purchased the property years and years ago from the Sidurskis.
Okay.
And they were involved with all of them people coming through. And there was a old well out in the front yard that I had almost swear on a Bible not to dig down and bother it because there was there was life that was lost in that well where they put a lot of bodies, I guess. But that was in Kentucky Park. It was called Kentucky Park,
Kentucky,
right off
where
Kentucky
is it?
Avenue.
Right
at
off of
the corner.
Kentucky. Okay, and then
That
I'm
was the
trying to
old
think.
quarry. When you're talking old quarry, there was a quarry on the property.
Okay, yep, that does sound familiar to me now, because there was bodies found near that quarry as well. But there's also this road, I'm trying to remember the road that's in the East End that still exists. It's an L-shaped road that comes off of Kentucky Avenue. And it was notorious for being a spot where a lot of the Purple Gang members would hang out. And there was actually this 3-story house that I tell this story all the time. There was this 3-story house that was built there. It was actually it was a fake house around a 3-story still. And the state troopers bust that one day. They reassemble it in South Rockwood to show they're being serious about the prohibition laws. So yeah, that whole East End area, I would say almost every other house was somewhat involved in rum running or some kind of manufacture of alcohol.